what is nicotine? If you see this image that is up on screen, wherever it is right now, it's got a couple of nitrogens, it's got like a few ring structures, a few methyl groups, etc, etc. That is nicotine. Nicotine, when it is in things such as vapes or cigarettes or whatever kind of patches, injections that you are currently getting, it goes into the bloodstream. When it's inhaled, it is small enough or capable enough to be absorbed into the bloodstream, and then it will enter the brain. It will sort of do things to the brain cells, which is what I'm going to talk about in this video, which is the reasons and the mechanisms why nicotine is actually an addictive substance. Now, you probably would have heard of things such as neurotransmitters before. Dopamine, as an example, that is a very, very commonly used one, or it's not necessarily a common example of a neurotransmitter, but it's a common term that's used on the self-improvement internet space. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. You've got things like acetylcholine, all of which we're going to talk about in this video. They are neurotransmitters, and how a neurotransmitter works is you'll have this thing known as a synapse, where there is a gap between nerve sort of endings. A synapse is how an electrical impulse is able to transfer between nerve cells. So the impulse is going to come along the left side, the starting side of the synapse, and it will stimulate the neurotransmitters to travel across the synapse membrane, and it will end up attaching and binding to neurotransmitter receptors on the other end of the synapse, and that will then again stimulate things like ion influx and stuff to occur in that nerve cell, and that will then carry on going along and again, and it will just happen and happen. It happens at an almost unimaginably quick speed that it's almost impossible to fathom. When you've seen the animation maybe inside of your school, and it's like the neurotransmitters travel nice and like they float across the sort of synapse space and bind to the receptor, that's all going to happen like with a click of a finger. When you touch a hot hob, that's going to happen like 1,000 times as the synapses, as the electrical impulse travels up your arm and goes through, I don't know exactly how many synapses there's going to be inside of that particular space, but you know that that is a quick reflex that occurs when you touch something that's hot, that you didn't think was hot, and it's come as a surprise to you or whatever. Yeah, it's insanely quick how this stuff works, and nicotine is something that sort of affects the way that neurotransmitters work, either increasing, decreasing quantities, and stuff like that. But what nicotine does is when it gets in and around the sort of brain space, it will bind to something that is on the edge of the nerve cells, on the membrane. It's like a protein sort of channel. It will bind to something known as a nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, which will open the receptor up. This is what causes the neurotransmitters just to be able to influx, or ions to influx and stuff like that. I don't exactly know the full specifics of the mechanism, but I know that nicotine binds to this receptor, and that ends up having a cause and effect thing on lots of other things. The first effect being acetylcholine release. Now, nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, acetylcholine is one neurotransmitter. It's also in the name of the receptor that nicotine binds to. Acetylcholine is just acetic acid combined with choline. Not sure if this won't happen as a chemical reaction inside of the body, but if you imagine the two things, choline is I think choline might be a B vitamin, but it might have been declassified as it can be made by the body. But yeah, acetylcholine, it can cause a temporary increase in focus and attention. That's what you may have heard people, the reason that they do use nicotine is because immediately after you take it, you get that sort of stimulating rush almost, and just you have a lot of focus and you can do work. But that is only temporary because of all the other things that happen. You then get the cravings and the withdrawal, and you also have the psychological effect of maybe you want to experience that again, so you're going to use nicotine again. That can also be like an addictive sort of part of the quality that isn't chemical and is just plainly the fact that you want to do it again because you want to have that increased focus and attention, even though it is temporary. But the second thing that nicotine causes is dopamine spikes. Dopamine spikes, this is when the dopamine levels that are inside of the bloodstream, etc., it's when they're very, very high. And a dopamine spike is caused when you do a lot of instant gratification things. It's what's released when things are overstimulating, basically. It is the neurotransmitter that is responsible for reward cycles and stuff like that. Like, if you have high baseline dopamine, you're going to have a very, very, very high drive. you're going to want to do things and not necessarily care if there is a reward at the end of it. But if you have a low baseline dopamine, you're going to just look for easy rewards, and you're going to get the immediate spike, and then that's going to crash down again because it's not like a long-lasting, continuous thing. And when you sort of get that dopamine spike from potentially having some nicotine or whatever, and then it's going to crash down below baseline, so you end up craving even more and more of, not necessarily just nicotine, but just dopamine in general. That means you might scroll, but there are other things about nicotine that it does that's going to mean that there is a specific mechanisms to just nicotine addictions. But the third neurotransmitter that nicotine affects is norepinephrine. I'm hoping that I said that right, but norepinephrine, when it's in like a high quantity, it causes the sort of rush and the stimulation, the sort of the hyperactiveness of when you have like a nicotine sort of rush. If it's like your first time ever doing that kind of stuff, it's the stimulating thing, it's the rush, and yeah, maybe because you want to experience that again, that's going to be one of the reasons that it's also addictive. But over a long period of time, when you're consuming nicotine and you're using nicotine as a drug for an extended period of time, these cells, the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, become desensitized. They don't activate, they don't depolarize as much as they did before. So what your brain does is it creates more nicotinic acetylcholine receptors through protein synthesis. These sort of channels are made up of proteins and amino acids, but it will make more of them, and this will mean that you will still, to an extent, be able to feel that rush, because when the nicotine binds to it, that's when you've got to sort of get the rush. But if there are certain receptors that aren't going to activate as much because they're so desensitized, your brain is going to create more. And because there is more of them that need to be activated, that's going to cause the withdrawal symptoms, the cravings, because you want to just activate these receptors again. So even though nicotine, it affects multiple neurotransmitter systems inside of the body, once you become desensitized, you still get those dopamine spikes that I talked about in the second point, and you still like have that sort of baseline, and you still then want to have it again. You crave not just nicotine, but dopamine, and one of the ways that you get that is from nicotine. And all the other sort of combinations of things, it's not like a one and done, this happens, nicotine does this, so this happens. It's like it does it to multiple things, and they could all lead to certain ways that of addictions and habits developing, which is why it's such a potent like addictive drug, because it is so brain stimulating. You want to feel that brain stimulation again, so you use it, but then over time you don't feel that as much, but you're still addicted because of the dopamine, you're still addicted because it's creating more receptors and stuff. So different things happen at different stages. It's all very confusing, but it's incredibly addictive, and it's a hard cycle to break unless you have a very good testament of willpower. So I just don't recommend getting into that sort of stuff, and there are many other ways to get the sort of temporary increases in focus and attention, which is what many people will use nicotine for, as like a bit of an excuse in a way. But with that, I recommend subscribing, because I like this community of young tribal people who are willing to improve themselves so much more than they already have, and good luck.